Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and I'd like to welcome you to This Week in FCPA. First, a word from our sponsor, Affiliated Monitors. Founded in 2004, Affiliated Monitors provides professional, independent integrity monitoring and ethics and compliance assessments nationally and internationally and across almost all industries. With its knowledge of effective ethics and compliance programs and cultures, Affiliated Monitor is respected for its work as the corporate monitor on matters ranging from multinational corporations to small and mid-sized companies and even individuals. Having served in over 750 monitorships, no one has more experience as an independent monitor than the team at Affiliated Monitors. For more information on how an independent monitor can help improve your company's ethics and compliance program, visit our sponsor, Affiliated Monitors, at www.affiliatedmonitors.com. This week's episode, we look at two significant proposed GDPR fines out of the United Kingdom. Matthew Stevenson asked, why do FCPA resolutions take so long, and uses the Walmart case as a starting point for an exploration of this. Jay Rosen begins a 5-part series on suspension and disbarment over on Corporate Compliance Insights. We take a look at what finance professionals can learn from compliance, or rather about compliance, from recent corporate scandals. Deutsche Bank is now under scrutiny for its role in the 1MDB scandal. What is data maintenance and why is it so critical? CCOs and D&O coverage, and the Caremark decision is alive and well. These are some of the top stories we take a look at on This Week in FCPA. For the week ending July 12, 2019, the halfway to take it back edition. Thanks so much for listening to this episode. This Week in FCPA is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network and now a proud member of C-Suite Radio. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, along with Mr. Monitor himself, Jay Rosen, for This Week in FCPA, episode 162 for the week ending July 12, 2019, the halfway to take it back. Jay, the All-Star game has come and gone, and the Astros are halfway back to returning the World Series trophy to its rightful station, Houston, Texas. But we had an interesting FCPA compliance, ethics, and other stories week. So, I'm going to jump right into it.
Yep. Why don't you tell us about the GDPR doings from the other side of the pond?
Right. We had some very interesting GDPR proposed fines come out this past week. First up was the proposed fine against British Airways for its data breach, which they at least announced in September of 2018. It's approximately $230 million fine. And then 2 days later, the ICO announced, and that's the Information Commissioner's Office, who investigates and enforces GDPR in the United Kingdom, a proposed $99 million fine, which is about $140 million fine against Marriott. So the interesting thing, of course, about Marriott is it's not a UK corporation. It's an American corporation, and this comes largely around its acquisition of Starwood, but two very large proposed fines by the UK regulator, showing, I think, a clear intent to aggressively enforce the GDPR, both for English companies and non-English companies going forward. Jonathan Armstrong and I considered the British Airways fine in this week's episode of Live with GDPR. And then Kevin LaCroix, fellow U of M Law alum, I note for the record, who publishes the most excellent D&O diary, looking largely at insurance issues, took a look at corporate risk and data protection / data privacy in the context of insurance. And I thought it was a very interesting and well thought out piece. So we've linked to that in the show notes. But clearly this week tells us that GDPR is not only here to stay, but it's going to hurt some companies right in their pocketbook from data breaches. And this was not data privacy issues, but data breaches where, they were hacked. So Lots of interesting news around GDPR this week, Jay.
Hey, Tom. So another thing I wanted to point out that was interesting is Marriott's potential fine represents 2.5% of global turnover, and BA's potential fine is 1.5%. And the GDPR says that you could fine up to 4% of their annual revenue. So they've come in on the lower end of the spectrum for their cooperation, but it's still, as you noted, a large dollar figure. Next up, we still are kicking around the Walmart settlement, and we have a great article that comes to us from Matthew Stevenson from his Global Anti-Corruption blog. And Matthew decides to do a little extrapolating and guessing on what happened with the Walmart thing. And a couple points that he makes over is one of the things that us FCPA geeks and people who watch DPAs and NPAs need to really keep in mind is that the settlement that you read has been highly negotiated. So there's been a lot of care between the lawyers on each side trying to figure out what the company will and will not admit to. And what tends to happen and what Walmart did here was they admitted to a books and records infraction instead of to the fact that they actually bribed. So that's one thing that he points out. And the other thing he points out, which is near and dear to Mr. Monitor's heart, is the corporate monitor issue. And he hypothesizes that, all this stuff was initially saying in the press that it was going to be settled over 2 years ago in 2007. And he thinks what may have withdrawn this out was not only trying to see if they could get better terms with the Trump administration, but dealing with that negotiated language. And also what was really negotiated was the scope of the monitor and the length. The monitor is only there for 2 years as opposed to 3. And it's really narrowly defined what the monitor's purview is. So it's a great piece, and we link to the show notes. And next up, I'm starting a new series on corporate compliance insight. And in my next 5 blogs, I'm going to take a look at suspension and debarment and how that comes to play into monitoring. This is something that is one of our specialties at Affiliated Monitors. My colleague, Rod Grandin, is based in D.C., and he was formerly a suspension and debarment office with the Air Force. And in today's, in this week's article, we have an introduction into suspension and debarment and how it works and why it's used as a remedy. And what tends to happen is that suspension and debarment are not civil or criminal matters resulting in a penalty imposed on a party. Instead, they are administrative. And the tools both of suspension and debarment are used by the government to keep a potential to keep somebody who is actually providing services to the government to really keep them in line, and it's used as a mechanism to make sure that they will comply. So in the coming episodes, we're going to talk about how exactly it works, the difference between suspension and debarment, what is the convergence between the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and suspension and debarment, and then take a look at present responsibility and remedies. So it's a series that I enjoyed putting together, and I look forward to sharing it with you in the next few weeks. Tom, we've got something from one of our good friends, Matt Ellis, over at the FCPA America's blog. What's Matt thinking about?
Matt was at a recent conference where the FBI spoke, and he used that as really a starting point to talk about the FBI's expanded efforts into investigating bribery and corruption in Latin America. There is now a FBI legal attaché in Brazil, and the FBI has beefed up their Miami office. He put forward several, critical points, including that the FBI is prioritizing Latin America, as shown by its anti-corruption squad in Miami, that Latin American companies and individuals are going to be under the microscope. Certainly U.S. companies will as well. This is really more than just corruption. They're looking at kleptocracy, money laundering, and antitrust violations. The FBI's team really has a high level of cultural fluency, as it includes professionals who know the region, speak local languages, and are really familiar how business is done on the ground, and really have a finger on the pulse of cultural nuance, literally across Latin America. And then finally, and perhaps most significantly, is the close cooperation between other countries in Latin America and the FBI around investigating bribery and corruption. And this has, I think, been a theme for several years now, Jay, starting with Operation Car Wash and the cooperation between Brazilian prosecutors and the American prosecutors. And now you've got cooperation really in the investigative functions of a lot of these countries. The Odebrecht case blew off the top off of widespread bribery and corruption in Latin America. And I think the countries that have been involved are really moving forward to try to clean up and stop the invidiousness of corruption from literally rotting their governments from the inside out. So we linked to it in the show notes, and you should definitely check it out. Next up, Jay, Henry Engler has written an article that's published in Corporate Compliance Insights about what finance professionals guidance they can garner from several of the most well-known recent corporate scandals. And he took a look at Volkswagen, Novartis, and Tenneco. And he's got some interesting findings. And once again, this is focused on the finance professional. So it may sound simplistic to the compliance professional, but I would ask you to maybe rethink and revisit this within your own compliance program and how others in your organization may see things. So first up is rules versus norms in driving ethical behavior and an ethical culture. Second is empowerment versus policying. And finally, what's the speak up culture at your organization? And whistleblowing is a key component of that. And if you're in a culture that doesn't really honor or even respect that, it may put you behind the eight ball, certainly around getting a handle on nefarious activities that are going on.
I was going to say, Tom has something for us from the Banks Behaving Badly files. So who are we going to talk about this week?
Well, we could spend a whole episode on Deutsche Bank this week alone, Jay. They whacked 20% of their workforce on a worldwide basis. They are under investigation for money laundering. They've got troubles with branches in Eastern Europe. And now, to top it off, they are under investigation for their dealings with the Malaysian Sovereign Wealth Fund, the now infamous 1MDB. And it turns out that Deutsche Bank was a big loaner and funder of 1MDB. And when 1MDB couldn't get the bond deals done on a quick enough basis, they would just run over to Deutsche Bank and get a loan. And the information that was provided to Deutsche Bank to secure these loans has come into question. It's questions of whether Deutsche Bank did sufficient due diligence, whether they did sufficient due diligence and just simply chose to put their head in the sand around the persons running 1MDB, Jay Lowe, Tim Leisner, and those folks. So 1MDB continues to percolate along. It continues to grow, and it's now looking like it may drag in Deutsche Bank, which is probably the last thing Deutsche Bank needed to hear this week.
I would agree. Next up, we have another article coming to us from Corporate Compliance Insights from Kelvin Dickinson, and it's entitled, "In an Age of Increasing M&A Activity, Data Maintenance is the Key to Ensuring Compliance." And with M&A on the rise, a commitment to a strong data management program can help businesses to avoid expensive and often dangerous compliance and risk aggregation missteps. In this article, Kelvin uses the example of Bank of America's acquisition of Merrill Lynch. And just like also in an M&A perspective, when we talk about looking at the corporate culture and looking at the ethics and compliance program of a target, one of the things that Bank of America really neglected to do was to look at the data integrity of those accounts coming over from Merrill Lynch. So it was possible that the information could be siloed and could be out of date. And just like we talk about when you're doing an integration, and actually before an integration, that you need to actually look at the quality of the data, you need to clean it, and you need to put it in a perspective so you can move forward with it and use it there. So he concludes by saying a commitment to a strong data management program can help businesses avoid expensive and often dangerous compliance and risk aggregation missteps. So we link to that in the show notes. And then another form of liability that we're going to look about, and this was kind of hinted at in Matthew Stevens' article earlier, is talking about the different options for D&O liability insurance. This comes to us from the FCPA blog, from Janaya Mosconi, and from Julie DeMauro. And basically, companies can protect their executives from legal expenses and liability through indemnification and insurance coverage. When considering insurance, careful attention must be given to matching the exact insurance products with the riders to the risks sought to be transferred. There are two kinds of general risk that most corporations purchase. One is E&O, error and admissions policies, which are used to help protect against claims by clients arising out of professional services provided by the insured. And the second is D&O, which stands for directors and officers. And this is to insure the organization against itself for losses or defense costs. D&O coverage can be added to an E&O policy or purchased separately. The kicker is here that when it comes to the foreign bribery charges, D&O policies do not cover fraudulent, criminal, or intentional wrongful acts, although innocent directors remain fully covered even if the acts of their colleagues were intentional or fraudulent. So the authors bring up a real good point that this is something that you need to look at from a risk perspective for your company. You need to decide how much risk appetite you have, and then what type of policies are going to be appropriate for the type of organization that we have. So we link to that. So Tom, last up, we have an article dealing with the Caremark decision, and it's alive and well. So can you tell us how that applies to ice cream and the Harvard Law School blog?
So for those who may not be familiar with the Caremark decision, Jay, this is the decision by the Delaware Supreme Court that established a duty of each board to oversee a compliance program. It's been updated a little bit over the years, but it's still the basic decision. And this case involves the Texas icon, Bluebell ice cream. And unfortunately, a few years ago, Bluebell got into a huge scandal because they allowed bacteria to contaminate ice cream, which caused listeria to form, which was put in ice cream and actually killed consumers of the product. So obviously not good when you're a food product company when you put poisonous food out into the marketplace. But this lawsuit involves a suit against the company's board of director for not properly exercising their Caremark duties. And although it is food and food safety, the court's analysis is really something that every compliance practitioner and indeed every board needs to read, because they go through and list the deficiencies. Now, the board did have a safety committee or part of a committee that dealt with safety, but the board had the safety committee did not address food safety. There was no regular process or protocol requiring management to keep the board apprised of food safety compliance programs at the company. There was no schedule for the board to consider food safety on a regular basis, quarterly, biannually, or even annually. There was, during the key period leading up to the deaths of the customers, there was a report received by the board which would have at least raised, as the court notes, if not red, certainly yellow flags. And there was no evidence that was taken up by the board. The board was certainly given favorable information about food safety by management, but not the reports that presented a different picture. And finally, the board meetings minutes showed there was completely devoid of any suggestion there was a regular discussion of food safety issues. Now, one might think food safety issues would be relatively low on a board's scale, but Jay, this is where the risk-based approach articulated by the Department of Justice around the FCPA comes into play. If your product is food, your risk is food safety. And that means you need to measure, manage, and your food safety risk. And the court even called it out, a food safety risk management compliance program. So, or food safety compliance program. So it clearly is applicable in our anti-corruption compliance world. And it's a re-emphasis by the Delaware Supreme Court that the Caremark decision is alive and well. And if companies are not looking at compliance data, they are in grave danger of not only violating Caremark, but being held civilly liable in Delaware in suits against officers and directors. So a very interesting decision. I think very important decision for the compliance professional going forward.
So would I be right to extrapolate that if I was a company involved in the transmission of electric power, like Pacific Gas and Electric, and if I knew my wires and towers were faulty, some of them hadn't been repaired over 100 years, and I knew that they could potentially start a fire, would I not be doing my board duty by having oversight and taking the proper precautions not to burn down an entire town in Southern California?
Well, certainly that would never happen because that example is just so outrageous and no doubt due to your recovering screenwriter mindset of fiction, because I can't imagine any corporation ever doing that. But in the Hollywood world of movies that you live in, to make a great story. But you're absolutely right. Whatever your risk is, that needs to be addressed in an oversight capacity by the board of directors. Doesn't mean you have to get out there and go up on the towers to see the situation, but you darn well better be aware of what those risks are, what the company is doing to manage those risks, and what the compliance practice is around all of that. So it's spot on.
So going into the entertainment part of our podcast, it's the summer and you are trekking through compliance. Are there any episodes of the TOS, the original series, that you'd like to point out to our listeners?
So I have to say, Jay, that Journey to Babel has always been one of my favorites. It's the one that introduced Spock's parents. Jane Wyatt, who played his mother, she was actually Ronald Reagan's first wife. So that's how far back into Hollywood this show goes. But Sarek, Spock's father, it's a great role. And Sarek reprises that role up through the next generation. Mark Leonard, the actor who plays him. That was probably my favorite this week, but a lot of interesting compliance lessons learned. So I hope you'll check out Trekking Through Compliance. And as a little bit of a teaser for those listening on Friday or Saturday, Sunday will be the all-time Trek favorite episode, The Trouble with Tribbles. So we're more than halfway through our exploration of the original series. Today was episode 42, I believe. There's 79 episodes. Ben Lockwood and I are actually planning a special series in August on the science of Star Trek. So we're going to really see what themes we can tease out, Jay. And as you know, I've had a ton of fun doing it, and I hope our listeners are enjoying it as well.
That's awesome. And so another entertainment-themed podcast that Tom and I had dropped this morning is we have our latest episode of Popcorn and Compliance. And together with either a half full or half empty popcorn bucket, Tom and I look at the recently released Pixar Disney animation film Toy Story 4. So that's online now. Give it a listen, and you can listen to some of the compliance lessons that we draw from the movie and how we like it or not. And next coming up, Spidey will swing into town, and we will tape something within the coming week. So, Tom, any webinars or podcasts that we should share with our listeners?
Yeah, I'm doing a webinar with Jonathan Marks, Sean Friedland over at Hanzo, who is getting back from his honeymoon this weekend. Congratulations, Sean. is hosting us next Wednesday at 2 p.m. Eastern, and we're going to take a look at compliance research, trends, and enforcement actions from Q2. We've got some interesting research we're going to talk about. Obviously, the 2019 guidance evaluation of corporate compliance programs, but also the OFAC framework for trade sanctions compliance. We're going to talk about all of these things. So it'll be a very informative seminar. We put together, Sean and I put together a really nice little white paper summarizing kind of where we ended up in the end of Q2. So I hope you'll check it out. We've linked to registration in the show notes. It's no cost for the webinar. So I hope you'll join Jonathan, myself, and Sean.
So I think we can wrap this episode up with a bow. On behalf of Tom Fox, the compliance evangelist, and myself, Jay Rosen, Mr. Monitor, we'd like to thank you for joining us for episode 162 for the week ending July 12, 2019, the Halfway to Take It Back edition. Thanks so much for listening, and have a wonderful weekend.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of This Week in FCPA. If you have any questions on this episode, you can email Jay at jrosen@affiliatedmonitors.com. You can email me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. Thanks so much for listening. I hope you'll join us again next week when Jay and I explore next week's top compliance and ethics stories. I also hope you will check out Popcorn and Compliance, where Jay and I took a look at Toy Story 4 through the eyes of a compliance professional. This Week in FCPA is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network and a proud member of C-Suite Radio. Thank you again for listening.